The Historical Society of Ottawa acknowledges that as we share these stories from our past, we are on what remains the unceded land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. This series is a collaboration between the Historical Society of Ottawa and Rogers TV. I'm Ben Weiss. I'm with the Historical Society of Ottawa, where we've been telling Ottawa's great story since 1898. If you find Ottawa history as fascinating as we do, I urge you to check out our website, our monthly speaker series, and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And enjoy today's segment.
Hello, my name is Michael McBane. I'm the author of Bytown, 1847, Elizabeth Briere, and the Irish Famine Refugees. It's a little-known story about Ottawa's history. It's a story about a major Irish catastrophe that impacted Ottawa in 1847. It's part of a much broader narrative of the Great Irish Famine, which people know about. But we know less and less about how it impacted Canada in general, and particularly Ottawa. There is, in a sense, an Ottawa chapter to the Great Irish Famine. And the unique feature of this story is that it also focuses on the heroism of an individual, Sister Elizabeth Briere, who led a group of women who responded to this catastrophe with generosity and compassion and ingenuity, and helped alleviate an even greater disaster during a public health epidemic. So Bytown at that time was a major hub for the lumber industry, and was founded basically when they built the canal in the late 1820s to early 1830s. And for the construction period, many Irish workers arrived in Bytown. It was really the beginning of the Irish population of the community. And after that, there was wave after wave of Irish immigration to Ottawa and the Ottawa Valley. So much so that really this area of Ontario was the largest concentration of Irish in Canada, the Ottawa Valley. It's important to mention that because when you had this foundation of Irish settlement, it acted as a magnet for refugees who came later. So the Irish famine refugees who came to Canada, and particularly who came to the Ottawa Valley, almost all of them had family or friends that had written to them and invited them, in some cases helped them with the passage fare, etc. So really it's a phenomenon known as chain migration, where families first come and they're very conscious of wanting to help loved ones back in Ireland to come as well. The famine of 1845 to 1852 was a major, major disaster where Ireland lost basically half its population. Now people don't realize, but even today, the Irish population has never recovered from the population loss during the Great Irish Famine. Incredibly horrific scenes were unfolding. It was so dramatic that people could hardly believe it was actually happening. They suspected that people giving accounts of what was happening were exaggerating. And so you had a phenomenon which really, I guess, people today are aware of, is something called famine fatigue. People got tired of hearing about how disastrous it was and started to doubt whether it was really the case. But during that long series of years of famine, there was one year in particular which was the worst year, the worst death rates and the highest emigration, and that was 1847. And that's known in Irish history as Black 47. That's also the worst year of Canadian immigration history. So during that year, over 100,000 Irish left Ireland for Canada. 100,000 in one season. And of those 100,000, approximately 20,000 died in the effort to coming here or once they've arrived here. So deaths of 20,000 immigrants in one season gives you a sense of the scale of the catastrophe. So 1 million died in Ireland during that famine period, and 1.5 million left. And Canada was a major center because it was cheaper to come to Quebec from England and from Irish ports than it was to go to the US. And one of the reasons was Canada had really lax passenger regulation, and the Americans had stricter passenger regulation, which made the fare more expensive. So you were taking a big risk in sailing to Quebec in 1847, but nonetheless, that's where most of the migration came that year. The story of Ottawa starts, or the Irish immigrants coming to Ottawa, it starts with Grosse Ile, which was the major quarantine station in the St. Lawrence, an island just east of Quebec City. And all the passenger ships, hundreds of passenger ships, were required to stop at that quarantine station. Because as I mentioned, 1847 saw a major outbreak of typhus fever. And this was a highly contagious disease. And so many of the passengers contracted the disease on ship, and many of them, of course, got infected in the quarantine station. So thousands of the Irish immigrants died in Grosse Ile, and it's actually now a national site for Parks Canada, Grosse Ile. And if you were fortunate enough to survive the famine station, you would then sail, or at least you would be transported in barges pulled by steamship to Montreal, which was the next major embarkation point, just close to where the Ottawa River flowed down to the St. Lawrence. And there was major fever sheds there, and that was a location where over 6,000 immigrants died that summer at the fever sheds of Point Saint Charles. So if you survived Grosse Ile and survived Montreal, then you were headed in two directions to get to Bytown. Some came down the Ottawa River, as I mentioned, pulled in barges, open air barges, standing room only, in the summer of 1847, which in July temperatures reached 90 degrees. The other route was down the St. Lawrence and then up the Rideau Canal, a much longer route, but some were sent there because it was more profitable for the people running the steamboats. And so you can imagine the scene in Bytown, which was a relatively small town of, let's say, 5,000 people. And you had tens of thousands of people coming to Bytown from two directions, many of whom were sick with infectious disease. So it presented a public health disaster for Bytown, which was extremely ill-equipped to deal with such numbers arriving of sick people, with basically little or no social services. The only healthcare services was being provided by the Sisters of Charity, who had just arrived in Bytown 2 years earlier. And as you can see behind me is the scene of the Ottawa River, and this is where a lot of the traffic came by steamboat and just went up a mile or two to the Rideau Locks and where they disembarked. So the sisters had just set up a hospital, a very modest hospital, which used to be on St. Patrick Street, just in behind the cathedral. But they knew that with this infectious disease, they needed a separate hospital because they didn't want other people being infected. Plus, their school was close to their hospital, right beside it. So they wanted to separate these sick refugees with typhus. And so they built and arranged to have built a temporary immigrant hospital, which was located in what is now called Briere Street, so a few blocks away. And so they had made these preparations before the refugees landed that summer. So they started in the spring because they were reading newspaper reports what the looming disaster coming to Canada in terms of this mass emigration of sick refugees. In fact, the Sisters of Charity, because they were alerted by their mother house in Montreal, they were making more preparations than the government of the day, and because they were anticipating this disaster. So having set up the temporary hospital, the first migrants arrived the first week of June and got off at the Rideau Canal just above the locks. So basically just opposite current day National Arts Center, where they were met by the immigrant doctor, Dr. Van Cortlandt, and by the Sisters of Charity. Now, because it was a public health disaster and people were so terrified of getting this deadly disease, the sisters had real trouble getting anybody to help them physically go near the sick refugees. So the sisters met them and had to transport them themselves. So Elizabeth Briere and some volunteer sisters would load the sickest of the patients that they first met and bring them by wagon down to the temporary hospital about a mile away. And the procedure then was to put them into a house where they would be washed and given new clothes. And the most important thing that the sisters did was they deloused them. So they shaved them and deloused them and washed them. Now, when this happened, a lot of the Irish were saying, we feel so much better now that we're in a clean bed and have been washed and had been deloused. And of course, that would have been their first bath since they left Ireland 6 to 8 weeks earlier. Now, the amazing thing was the sisters, in delousing them, were breaking the chain of transmission of the disease. And this was an era when they had no medical knowledge of what really caused the disease. But that kind of procedure happened to have been the most effective medical treatment that they could have given at that time. And there's some accounts from the sisters, which I sought out, was really what kind of first-hand accounts or eyewitness accounts survive from that terrible summer in Bytown in 1847. And fortunately, there are a number of letters kept by the Sisters of Charity in their archives from Elizabeth Briere to her superior in Montreal, and some other letters from the Oblate Fathers who are reporting back on these incidents to their superiors in France. So these letters are really the primary source, the eyewitness accounts of what was happening. In addition, there was some newspaper accounts which survived, and there was some other eyewitness testimony from the immigrant agents who had left behind a letter book. So basically, with this stream of migrants, sick refugees coming into Bytown, it was said that Bytown had become a lazaretto, which was basically a quarantine station. So at this temporary hospital, which is a very modest wooden structure, the sisters treated over 550 patients, and about 150 of them died that summer. So they saved a lot of lives. Now, interestingly, 17 of the 23 sisters caught the typhus themselves, but amazingly, none of them succumbed to the illness, whereas their co-sisters in Montreal, many of them died at Point St. Charles. And many other Canadian first responders succumbed to the typhus that summer in helping these refugees. There was one fatality of a first responder in Bytown, the Reverend, the Presbyterian minister, who was the only known first responder who succumbed to the illness. So the amount of effort that it took and the courage by the sisters to organize this kind of response to a public health disaster was amazing. And on top of that, to make matters worse, there was some resistance within some of the leadership of Bytown at the time, who were very sectarian and resented the sisters because they were Catholics and were not really wanting to help. So at the end of this terrible season, after they had taken care of the folks and fed them and treated them, the government said it wasn't going to pay the bills of the Sisters of Charity at the end of the season, which was quite an outrageous reaction to this humanitarian response on behalf of the Sisters of Charity. So what happened was the Irish community responded with outrage. There was a very strong editorial in the Bytown Packet, which was edited at the time by a strong Irishman named Henry Friel. And it also happened to be in that December, at the end of the season, they were entering into an election campaign in Upper Canada. And so Henry Friel was telling the Irish of Bytown and the Ottawa Valley to remember the government treatment of the sisters and who had saved so many Irish refugees. Remember them at the polls when you go to vote. Within 3 days of that editorial, the government reversed itself and paid the sisters, paid them the bills that they were due. One of the things to keep in mind as well that the attitude of some of the government officials to the Irish refugees at the time could be summarized in the phrase of colonial contempt. Colonel Gray, who was the colonial secretary in Downing Street, basically said it would be unwise to give too much help to the Irish, because then they would get too reliant on welfare. So he said it's better to let them suffer too much than too little. That was the kind of colonial mentality. But fortunately, when they came to Bytown, they were met with Canadian compassion. That's another big part of this story, is the compassion on the local populations in Canada that received this huge flood of sick Irish refugees in 1847. So the sisters received lots of support, particularly from the women of Bytown. There were women volunteer committees in each neighborhood. The women were supplying food and blankets and all kinds of supplies to the hospital. So that Canadian compassion is really a big part of this story. And the third element of the story is really Irish resilience. So in spite of the fact that 20,000 died, it meant that over 80,000 survived and went on to become very successful. And a part of this story too is the Irish never forgot the help they received from the French-Canadian Sisters of Charity. And later in life, there's stories of some of these survivors who came back in their old age from the Ottawa Valley where they had moved to, came back to Briere Street, to the convent, to thank the Sisters of Charity for what they had done. And so that's really a part of Ottawa history, which I think it's important to remember. Remember the compassion, to remember the resilience, because really this is a story unfortunately in our world today, which is becoming far too common. And so we can draw strength from our past stories and our past history and get inspiration from this courage, the courage of someone like Elizabeth Briere. A little known story which deserves to be much better known. Thank you for your time.